How do you host a podcast on a budget? I want to take you back to 2015. At that time, I was a freshman in college going to my sophomore year of college. I was running a different company at that time, and I thought to myself, well, it would be pretty cool for me to go out there and start my podcast. I wanted to interview successful individuals, your seven, eight, nine figure, whether they were entrepreneurs or investors or just anyone that was very successful that I wanted to interview. Because I knew at that time I didn't have a ton of money and I was geographically in a small portion town. I wouldn't say it's a small town, probably a pretty big town, 100,000 people in Massachusetts, but in a small state and didn't have a lot of access to people across the country, couldn't fly, that type of thing. What I'm getting at is I couldn't reach out to someone, say, hey, can I buy you a cup of coffee? I'd like to pick your brain. That's going to be a little bit more difficult. So, what I did is I leveraged my podcast to say, hey, I'd love to interview you on my podcast for 30 minutes. I'll promote it to my email list, I'll promote it across the different social media channels. And that's when I ended up getting the buy in through the different individuals that came on my podcast. But again, take you back to 2015, I was bootstrapping this on my own. I didn't have time to hire an editor to make it professionally done. Just different things like that. Hire a company like ours to go out and find and source guests. So what I wanted to go over in this episode today, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on our podcast, is how you can start a podcast on a budget, or how you can host a podcast on a budget just based on my experience of really not having a ton of money early on and just trying to bootstrap my way through. So the first thing that I learned on my own was video, or I didn't say video, audio editing. And through audio editing, I really just used YouTube. When I was on a PC, I downloaded Audacity. I believe that was free. And when I'm on my Mac, which I have now, I use GarageBand that was automatically installed. And those are just the two softwares that I had used, whether again, PC, I used Audacity. On my Mac, I used GarageBand. And I just watched YouTube tutorials on how to edit a podcast on it. Pretty simple. I mean, it initially took me like 6 hours to edit an episode. And I got that down to like 15, 30 minutes. It's just, you get better over time. It can definitely be a little overwhelming in the beginning. But I just want to preface that again, I use GarageBand on a Mac, Audacity on a PC. And then from there, the next thing that I wanted to get was figure out how can I get guests on my show. So the first thing I did is I went through my bookshelf. I saw the different authors that I have, wanted to reach out to them. I just went on Instagram and was just looking at different folks on Instagram, seeing if I got any ideas from there. Then I went on Amazon and looked at the best-selling books that had a release coming out in the next 90 days, different things like that, and got ideas that way. Then I went out and I looked at other podcasts, saw the guests on those shows, then built, and then over time, I really just built this list. Initially, I started with 50 individuals, and then I just really built it up from there. And then I wrote the pitch myself, and then I reached out to the guests on my own. So that way I didn't have to pay a company like ours to go out and do all this legwork. I mean, it definitely takes time. That's why people hire us as their company to do it. When I was early on in bootstrapping it, I didn't have the option to hire a company. I was the one just going out and doing it on my own. So that way, both those options of your software is free, booking guests on your show is free. Now, when you think, okay, now when it comes to hosting, what should I do? Well, you could use Zoom, and I use Zoom, and I believe if it still stands, that you can get a free account to record interviews, and it'll be like 40 minutes or so. So, and then after 40 minutes, you have to pay for the premium version. So, let's say you're like, okay, I'm only going to have my interviews being 20 to 30 minutes, and then it's worth getting the free version of Zoom if you think you have to pay. If you want more than that, then you're going to have to pay. But nonetheless, 40 minutes is definitely a long time for a podcast interview, especially if you're just starting out. So again, Zoom would be free. You'd want to have some sort of Calendly link, some sort of scheduler. I recommend using Calendly. I find that helps me. So that way I'm not going back and forth with the guests asking, hey, are you available now? Are you available here? And just going back and forth because people just wouldn't book as a guest on your show. So I'd want to have a calendar link to schedule. You can use Calendly. I would probably recommend getting the paid version of that just because it'll send reminders of people that you have the podcast interview coming up. And if you don't have the paid version of it, I don't believe that it sends reminders. I think the paid version would probably run you like $10 to $12 a month. It's really overall it's pretty inexpensive. So I definitely recommend paying for that because again, it's just gonna be a headache going back and forth all the time, trying to figure out when the person is available to be a guest on your show. After having the scheduling link, the next thing you want to go out and get is a podcast mic. Now, the podcast mic is probably going to be where you spend your most amount of money. And I use a Blue Yeti right now. That's going to run you about 120, $130. When I was first starting, I used the Blue Snowball. And I believe that was about $50. Maybe it's gone up a little bit since then. But I recommend that for just a nice, good quality budget microphone. So that's going to run you about $50. And then after you have the microphone in place, you'll probably want to have some cover art created. So I'd recommend just a platform like Fiverr. I mean, there's people that would design your cover of your podcast for like $5 or $10. Just something simple like that. Really doesn't have to be that expensive. Outside of that, you're gonna have to host your podcast. You can host on like Libsyn or Buzzsprout. I've done it both. On those, there's a numerous different spots where you could host your podcast, and you could probably spend anywhere from like $10 to $20 a month having it hosted. I just recommend paying for it. I find overall it's better just paying for the nice hosting aspect of it. So you can think through the expenses we have right now with the podcast mic. That's just a one-time fee, $50, say $60 even. Then we have our calendar link. That's going to say $10, and then we have $20 for the hosting. So right then 10, 20, 50, or say 60. So you're at $90 all in right now for your podcast. And then outside of that, you could use a website, but you could even use like a Buzzsprout and make it look nice, professional, and so they help you have like a custom sort of looking website with your podcast. And I believe that's included on the hosting package as well. So you don't have to really spend that much money on a website. You can just do it through that avenue. So it'd really be under $100. You could get your podcast started, and then for about $30 of ongoing monthly fees. And not just hosting it. You want to have the podcast hosted on a hosted website instead of putting it all on your website, because like the files are just going to be so big that it would crash your website. And that's obviously not what you want. And then just for peace of mind and simplicity's sake, you want to make sure you have a scheduler. So yeah, that's really everything you need to know to start a podcast on a budget. Really everything I'd be looking at to start a podcast under $100. But that's exactly how I bootstrapped my podcast. And hopefully that was helpful for you.